Imagine borrowing $10,000 from a bank. You spend it. You pay it back. But here's the strange part. Where did that $10,000 actually come from? Was it sitting inside a vault? Did someone else deposit exactly $10,000 before you borrowed it? And if you keep paying the bank every month, who is actually getting richer? Because the history of money is also the history of debt. And debt is much older than banks. Thousands of years before credit cards, mortgages, and online banking, people were already borrowing things they didn't have. Food, animals, grain, silver, and eventually, money. The story begins in ancient Mesopotamia. More than 4,000 years ago, some of the world's earliest civilizations were keeping records of loans on clay tablets. Imagine that. No bank apps, no contracts printed on paper, no credit scores, just a piece of clay. And a person recording exactly how much someone owed. A farmer might borrow grain before harvest. He would receive the grain immediately. Then, after the harvest, he would repay it, usually with more grain than he originally borrowed. That extra amount was the beginning of something that still controls modern finance. Interest. Borrow $100, pay back $110. The extra $10 is the price of borrowing someone else's money. Simple. But this created a huge problem. What happens when the borrower cannot pay? Imagine a farmer borrows grain. Then the harvest fails. He still owes the grain. The debt doesn't disappear just because his crops did. So he borrows again. And now he owes even more. This could create a cycle that was incredibly difficult to escape. And governments eventually realized something important. If too many people become trapped in debt, the entire society can become unstable. So, ancient rulers sometimes canceled debts, not because they suddenly became generous, because they understood something surprisingly modern. A debt system can create enormous wealth, but it can also destroy the people who owe the money. And then something changed. As civilizations became larger, trade became more complicated. People didn't always want grain. They wanted silver, animals, land, buildings, ships. Eventually, merchants needed a way to move enormous amounts of wealth without physically carrying it everywhere. And this is where the ancestors of modern banking began to appear. People started storing valuable goods, recording ownership, lending money, moving payments between distant cities. The basic idea was incredibly powerful. You didn't need to carry your wealth with you. Someone else could keep the record, and that record could represent your money. But then came an even bigger transformation. Banks discovered that they didn't simply have to store money. They could lend it, and when they lent it, they could earn interest. This created a machine. People deposited money. Banks lent money. Borrowers paid interest. Banks earned money. And the cycle continued. But here's the part that surprises most people. Modern banks don't simply take piles of cash from one person and hand those exact piles of cash to another person. When a bank makes a loan, the banking system creates a corresponding deposit in the borrower's account. In other words, your loan can become someone else's bank balance. Money and debt become connected. One side of the balance sheet says, someone owes money. The other side says, someone has money. And suddenly, money is no longer just coins sitting inside a vault. It is also a network of promises. Promises to repay. Promises to accept payment. Promises that the financial system will continue working tomorrow. And that changes the way we should think about money. Because when you look at your bank account, you might think you are looking at wealth. But your bank account is also a claim on the banking system. Your money exists inside a giant network of records, contracts, loans, deposits, and promises. And that network is enormous. Mortgages, car loans, credit cards, business loans, government debt, student loans, corporate debt. Almost everywhere you look, someone owes someone else money. And here's the strange part. Debt doesn't necessarily mean someone is doing something wrong. Debt can be incredibly useful. A business can borrow money to build a factory. A family can borrow money to buy a house. A student can borrow money to get an education. A country can borrow money to build infrastructure. Without credit, many things that define modern civilization would be much harder to build. But debt has another side. The person borrowing gets something today and promises to give something back tomorrow. And nobody knows exactly what tomorrow will look like. Maybe your income disappears. Maybe the business fails. Maybe the economy crashes. Maybe interest rates rise. Suddenly, the promise becomes much harder to keep. And this is where the history of money becomes a history of power. Because the person who controls access to credit can influence what other people are able to do. Who gets to buy a house? Who gets to start a company? Who gets to expand a business? Who gets rescued when things go wrong? And who gets left behind? For thousands of years, the basic question has remained surprisingly similar. Who owes? Who owns? And who gets to decide the rules? Today, you can borrow money with a few taps on a phone. The process feels completely different from a farmer borrowing grain in ancient Mesopotamia. But underneath the technology, the basic idea is almost the same. Someone gives you resources today. You promise to return them later. And usually, you pay for the privilege. The clay tablet became the contract. The merchant became the banker. The silver became the bank balance. The handwritten record became the digital database. But the promise remained. You owe. Someone is owed. And somewhere in between those two sides, an entire financial system exists. So the next time you see a number in your bank account, remember what that number really represents. It isn't just money. It represents trust, records, promises, debt, and thousands of years of financial history. The strange thing isn't that humans invented money. It's that we built an entire civilization around something even more powerful. The promise that someone will pay tomorrow.